And it's an honor for me to be here, to see so many old friends and new friends. In effect, this is my first formal public speeches outside the bank since I took the office. And I reserved this speech to come to Peterson Institute for two reasons. Because Fred and Peterson Institute have been the inspiration of my work when I returned to work to establish the China Center for Economic Research. And Fred has been so encouraging to me. And also, after I took the job in the World Bank, I consulted with Fred several times on important issues. We established working relation, and I really benefit a lot from this relationship. And for that reason, I certainly should give my first public speeches at the Peterson Institute. And since this is my first speeches, people will wonder what kind of experiences I have. It's the chief economist of the World Bank. And I like to say, I cannot choose a much better time to come to the World Bank. It's the chief economist. Because in the past 8 months, we know that we are entering into a very challenging time for the world, but exciting time for economists. When I first arrived in June the 2nd, at that time, the focus of the World Bank, as well as the world, was how to cope with the food crisis, fuel crisis, its implication on poverty. And we estimate about 100 million of people was affected. And the World Bank has the obligation to help them. And I took the first week of being a chief economist to West Africa. And I remember on my way back, I made one stop in London and to talk with Martin Wolf. And at that time, he and I agreed. The challenge for the world was inflation, how to cope with the inflation. However, when I returned from the trip, I started to have some discussion with my colleagues in the bank. Yes, inflation was a challenge. But after we solved the issue of inflation, were we going to encounter another issue? That is deflation. At that time, I think most people think deflation is something too far away, something impossible. I think that was a position not only in the bank, I guess among most of the economic communities. I remember that at the end of August, Fred and I and many of you here participate in the Jackson Hole meetings. Certainly at that time, people discuss about the subprime crisis, what lesson we can learn from the crisis, how to improve the regulation, supervision, and so on. But most people think it can be managed. The subprime crisis can be managed. I attend a dinner organized by Jim Wolfenson, and with a group of very prominent central bankers, leading scholars. And in that dinner, we discussed 30 years from now, will people still remember this subprime crisis? And at that time, the consensus seemed to be maybe 30 years from now, subprime crisis would be forgotten by most people at most, a small case study in the textbook of financial economics. And the reason why people are disconfident because we learned lessons from the past crisis. So some mistakes, like the Great Depression, we will not committed. Some mistakes like the Japanese in the 1990s, we were not committed. And also some mistakes like in East Asia financial crisis, we will not make the same mistakes. However, only 2 weeks from the meeting, the Lehman Brothers issue started to appear. And this subprime crisis turned into a full-fledged financial crisis. And it spread from the US to all the developed countries. And luckily, as someone like me in the World Bank, we are responsible for the developing country. And we know that in the first round financial crisis, the developing country were doing well. But the developing country are affected by the second round effect through the trade channels, through the reduction of FDI, private capital flow, through the reduction of remittance, as well as the collapse in the commodity prices. And so by the time of annual meeting, people agree. Now we had an economic crisis. The rapid growth in the period of 2002 to 2007 and the first half of 2008 came to an end. And the projection by IMF colleagues, by my colleagues at the World Bank, reduced the projection. And at that time, we think the world economic growth rate in 2009 is likely to be 0.9%. And for the high-income country, it's likely to have a 0.1% reduction in GDP, and the developing country can maintain at about 4.5% growth rate this year. But after the projection was released, there are so many bad news almost every day. And people started to revise their projection. And we know that, like IMF released its projection at the end of January, now indicate the global economy is going to grow at about 0.5% in PPP term. But if you turn that into the exchange rate, official exchange rate, the world economy is going to contract in 2009. And the US is going to decline 1.6%, Euro areas 2%, Japan 2.5%, developing country 3.3%. But again, this projection has been revised and revised again. I think that you noticed last night, the Dominic Strauss-Kahn had a speech in Malaysia, and the first time he used the term depression. And this is the period in the past 8 months that I, as the chief economist of the World Bank, certainly now we still hope 2009 we can see the bottom of this crisis. We still project that 2010 the global economy is going to recover. However, all the projections show some kind of warning. There are many uncertainties there. The downside risk is extremely high. And I do agree, we are in an era who face a lot of downside risk. This recession, this crisis, is likely to protract it. And why I think this crisis is likely to protract it? Because if we look into the collapse in the equity market, in the real estate market, and its disturbance to the real economy, it is almost the same as the Great Depression. It is almost the same as what happened in Japan in 1990s. Certainly, as people in Jackson Hole say, We learn a lesson from the past. We will not make the same mistakes. And so all the government in the world quickly come into action and provide some kind of rescue plan to help the financial institution, to recapitalize them, to avoid them to melt down. And that is a lesson that we learn from the Great Depression. So for that, I'm confident, and like all of you here, we are not going to have 20% or 30% reduction in our GDP. And that is a good news. However, regarding the issue, how long we can get out of the current crisis, whether the recession or depression are going to protract or not, very much depends on two things. One is whether we can overcome the protectionism or not. And the second thing, whether we have the wisdom to come up some kind of decisive, large enough, coordinated fiscal stimulus among the developed country and developing country and implement those kind of stimulus package at the same time. The reason why I think those two are the key for the protection is that because this crisis was preceded by 6 years of boom. And in those 6 years, there were a lot of investment, like in high-income country, real estate sectors. And in the developing country, in the manufacturing sectors. I can give just one figure. The growth rate of investment in the developing country as a group. In the 1980s, the annual growth rate was 1.6%. In the 1990s, 2.9%. And in the past 6-7 years, 11.9%. Certainly, it was fueled by many things like large inflow of capitals, like increase in the commodity prices and so on. But those investment now is coming to complete. They're turning into capacities. And so capacity increase. But at the same time now we have the collapse of equity markets. People estimate that the loss of value, wealth, is already 30 trillion US dollars. We also have the collapse of the housing sectors. And the loss of value certainly now is about different estimation, 5 trillion, 9 trillion, 10 trillion. But the prices continue to fall. So under that kind of situation, we know that's going to have some kind of wealth effect. People get poorer, and especially some of them become highly indebted. They lost their value in their pension fund, and so on. So they need to reduce their consumption, to increase their saving, to cope with the rainy days ahead. And capacity increase, but demand reduce. It's going to have excess capacity. It's going to have excess capacity. And with the existence of excess capacity, I think a financial rescue plan is important. It avoids the melting down of financial institutions. But it's not enough, because even the financial institution does not collapse. They may not have the opportunity to give out the loan. I just came back from Davos, and I went to Kuwait after the Davos. And I met with a very senior bankers, the chairman, the CEO of Kuwait National Banks. And he told me his bank did not have any lending in the past 2 months already. And I asked him, how come? Are you in some kind of a lot of toxic assets, something like that? He said, no, but no people come to me. So that's the reason why he would not give out loan. And why no people come to him? Because with excess capacity, it's very hard to find good investment opportunities. And as long as people are responsible, they will not borrow. So under this kind of situation, if excess capacity exists there, the economy is likely to be trapped into some kind of vicious cycles. With excess capacity, we know that profitability of the firm drops. Some of them will go bankrupt. Or at least they need to reduce their workforce. So unemployment will increase. Job security reduce. People will become even more conservative. And under that kind of situation, consumption drop. But consumption drop will make the excess capacity even bigger. And that's the reason why, if we look into the statistical data, in the last quarters, all of a sudden, export reduced dramatically. Import reduced dramatically. The order to the factory reduced dramatically. And I'm sure that all of you know this data. And under this kind of situation, politician is likely to turn into some kind of protectionism. Although we know in November G20 meeting, all the leaders say we should continue to have open policies. We should complete the Doha run. We should embrace the globalization. But because of the loss of job, people started to make a pressure on their Congress. Their Congress make a pressure on their government to retain the job domestically. But in Jackson Hole, we say we learned a lesson from the Great Depression. One lesson we already learned: should not allow the banking sector to go bankrupt. The other lesson is that we should avoid protectionism. One reason why the Great Depression was so serious, because at the time people resort to protectionism. Certainly in the short run, it seems to protect the job at home. But we know if you protect the job at home, other countries will reduce the export. They are going to lose more job there. If they are going to lose more job, their income will drop, and they won't have the ability to import from you. And at the end, everyone loses job. But the tendency of that is increasing. And I hope that Peterson Institute, under the leadership of Fred Bergstein, we can work together to provide the intellectual underpinning for continued globalization, continued free trade. But in addition to that, I think if we have an excess capacity situation, people know monetary policy may not be effective, because at the most you can reduce the interest rate down to 0. But if you have an excess capacity, you don't have good investment opportunities, people will not come to borrow. Just what I found in Kuwait. And under this kind of situation, I think that some kind of fiscal stimulus package, large enough to compensate the reduction in the consumption, would be necessary. But this kind of fiscal stimulus package need to be coordinated. Every country needs to do that, because this is a global crisis. If only one or two countries carry out the fiscal stimulus package, and with the open trade, we know it's going to have a lot of leakage to other countries. And under the kind of situation, many countries will be reluctant to participate, to take the necessary decisive action. But even with coordinated fiscal stimulus now, I think it seems to be a consensus among many economists. I'm not the first one, and I will be the last one to talk about that. But even when we look into the fiscal stimulus, there are two troubles, there are two issues we need to overcome. The first one is low-income country. We know that low-income country, they enter into this crisis in many countries because of the fuel and also the food prices. The government increased the subsidies. Their fiscal position are very weak already. Their fiscal space It's very limited already. And secondly, many of them already have huge current account deficit. According to some study, 1/3 of the developing country, they already run 10% of, they already run the current account deficit that as large as 10% of their GDP. And under this kind of situation, either because of physical space, or even they have physical space, they may be constrained by their foreign reserve to carry out this fiscal stimulus package together with the high-income country. That's one thing. And for the high-income country, certainly they may be in a better position. Like the US is a reserve currency country. Like Euro, their currency is semi-reserve, so they can always adopt some kind of fiscal stimulus supported by their monetary policy. But for high-income country to adopt this kind of fiscal stimulus, I think economists always argue, are they going to be effectiveness or not? Can they really push up the demand or not? This is because people argue, if the government spends the money, they either need to issue bonds to support the expenditure, or they need to collect tax in the future to pay for that. And we know that no matter the government use bond or use tax, there are some kind of Ricardian equivalence. If the government raises tax now, people have less money to spend. If the government issue bond, people need to save and to pay for that in the futures. And certainly, this is a theoretical model. People can argue there are many ways that Ricardian equivalence may not be true. But money needs to be paid eventually. And so those effect will be there. And how large that can, how large the stimulus package effect will be is an empirical issue. And I say that the crisis we encounter this time, in terms of collapse in the real estate market, in the equity market, and its impact on demand, consumption, it's very similar to Japan. And we know Japan in the 1990s. They have a lost decades, and caused by similar causes. During the period of time, Japanese government was very aggressive in adopting fiscal stimulus. In 1991, the public debt as a percentage of GDP was 60%. By the time of 2002, it increased to about 140. That means what? 80% increase in the government debt in the period of 11 years. On the average, the stimulus each year was about 7%. It should be considered as very large, very decisive, but we know Japan did not get out of the crisis, the deflation. It was because when the government spent more money, people saved more, and the total impact in terms of stimulation to the demand was very small. And so, even we have the wisdom to come up with some kind of coordinated fiscal stimulus, there's still an issue. Whether this stimulus is going to really increase the demand large enough to absorb the excess capacity now has been building up every day. And if we look carefully, the issue about this kind of possibility of not effective is how this money is going to be paid. If this money is going to be paid by taxpayers from their income, I think either large or small, the Ricardian equivalence consideration will be there. But can we find some kind of ingenious way that the project to pay for the cost itself? And from my experience in China, there's a possibility for that. We know that in 1998, China encountered a situation very similar to now. That was East Asian financial crisis. And all of a sudden, China encountered deflation. And from 1998 to 2002, those 5-year period, it was a deflationary period. So the Chinese government at that time adopted a very aggressive fiscal stimulus package and to stimulate demand. And that package, not only in the short run, enabled China to have a deflation on the one hand and an average 7.8% growth rate, the highest growth rate during that period in the world, on the other hand. But more important was that with the stimulus package, most of the project was on the bottleneck of China's growth, like highway system, port facility, telecommunication, education, and so on. And after 5 years, those kind of projects released the bottleneck of Chinese growth. For example, before 1998, whenever China had a higher growth rate, China, like many other developing countries, had a 2-digit inflation rate. Now we know that inflation was a result of bottleneck. And the bottleneck was in the infrastructure, like highway system. In 1998, China only had 4,700 kilometers of highway. And with this fiscal stimulus, the highway system in China increased more than 5 times in those 5-year periods. So when China entered into a new phase of growth in 2003, we find the growth rate was enhanced. In 1979 to 2002, the average annual growth rate in China was 9.6% per year. And many people at that time say it was impossible for China to continue those kind of 9 and plus growth rate continuously, because even Japan, the 4 small dragons, during their best performing periods was about 20 years. In those 20 years, they maintained about 9% growth rate. After 20 years, the growth rate all dropped down to 7, 6, or 5%. And China cannot be an exception. However, if you look into the case, after 2003 to 2008, the average growth rate in China increased from 9.6% up to 10.8%. And during this period of time, inflation in China was very small, only 3, 4, at most 5%, 6%. And the reason was because during the fiscal stimulus period, deflation period, China used those money to release the bottleneck. And with a higher growth rate, the revenue increase paid those costs. We have many people study Chinese economy here, we know. In 1990s, the government debt as a percentage of GDP was 30%. 2007, it reduced down to 20%. And during that period, tax rate was reducing. And so this gives me some kind of concept. If we can use this fiscal stimulus package, those money, to invest in areas which are the bottlenecks of the economy, we can overcome the Ricardian equivalence. We can stimulate demand in the short run, at the same time pave a much better foundation for the long-term growth. So with this, I'd like to propose to you a new initiative for your consideration. And this new initiative is for the purpose of one stone to kill not only 2 birds, maybe 4 or 5 birds. The way is that we know that a coordinated fiscal stimulus for every country, both high-income country and low-income country, is necessary. Low-income country is constrained by their fiscal space, their foreign reserve space. Under this kind of situation, the high-income countries should reallocate part of their fund to the low-income country to help them carry out the bottleneck reduction type of project. And under this kind of situation, we can solve the low-income countries' physical space, at the same time create a condition that the project will pay for itself in the future. By this, I think that when the high-income country consider their physical stimulus, certainly, they can also follow this spirit. For example, the US, the European country, they can invest in the green economy, they can invest in the infrastructure. But fundamentally, we know the space of that kind of investment is limited. And so under this kind of situation, to make this fiscal stimulus package effective, they should allocate some of the fund to the low-income country. And low-income country, we know, has a lot of fiscal space. I mentioned that when I first came to the job, the first week I did my discussion with Martin Wolf. At that time, the worry was inflation in the low-income country. And we know that inflation means there's a lot of bottleneck there. And it's easy to identify. And if we can do that, the low-income country can participate in this coordinated fiscal stimulus. In the short run, they'll create a demand domestically. But in an open global economy, the demand in the developing country will create a demand for the high-income country. And at the same time, with this kind of project, the low-income country will have a much better opportunity to have a sustained growth after the crisis. We are going to have a more inclusive, sustainable growth for the whole world. And in this spirit, I think that the President Rodrick recently proposed the vulnerability fund that asked the high-income country with the US as a leadership to contribute 0.7% of their fiscal stimulus for the low-income country. It's in the right direction. In April meeting, in the spring meeting last year, Rodrick argued for the 1% solution, asked the sovereign fund to contribute 1% of their fund to set up an Africa Development Fund. And that is also in the right direction. However, consider the global crisis we are encountering now. I think we need to be more aggressive. We need to be more imaginative. And I'd like to propose a global recovery fund in the spirit of Marshall Plan for development. I'd like to propose that the high-income country, with the leadership of the US, and foreign reserve rich country like China and oil exporting country, to contribute $2 trillion for the coming 5 years, each year with $400 billion. And that was about 1%. That is about 1% of the GDP of the high-income country now. To help the low-income country to participate in this global coordinated fiscal stimulus, and to help them to invest in the bottleneck they are encountering now. And for this, we already have some institution can carry out that if there's a commitment. World Bank and other regional development banks are built up for the purpose of reconstruction, for the purpose of helping the developing country to do those kind of projects. And the project is not so hard to identify because bottleneck is obvious to everyone who ever traveled to Africa, for everyone ever traveled to South Asia or any other developing country. And I hope, with the help of Peterson Institute and everyone here, we start to think of this proposal. We start to approach our politicians, our national leadership, to have a discussion of this plan at G20 meeting in April in London. So let me conclude. We are entering a very challenging time. The crisis now everyone understands is the serious one since the Great Depression. We may let this crisis become a protracted crisis, and that will cause a lot of harm to the poor people. It will deprive the opportunity for many developing countries to get out of poverty, to achieve the goal of MDGs. But it also gives us an opportunity. If we can work together, then we have the opportunity to get out of this crisis in a shorter period of time, but at the same time pave a foundation for long-term inclusive and sustainable growth for everyone in the world. Certainly, we need to have a leadership. The leadership, from what I see, need to be the U.S., because the U.S. is the largest economy in the world. Its currency is the reserve currency. They have the largest space to do something as I proposed. And other high-income countries, Eurozone, their currency is likely to be reserve currency in the future. One of the reserve currency in the future. Certainly, an early recovery of the world will be helping the Eurozone also, so they should also join. And reserve-rich countries like China, dynamic growth in the world is good for China, for all the reserve-rich countries, so they also need to join. If we have this wisdom and leadership, then we may come to a new multilateralism in the post-crisis period. And that's the reason why this initiative might be one stone, kill many, many birds. Thank you.